Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. UFOs are frequently reported to be hiding in or near clouds. Case in point, last season we examined a 1971 photograph of an alleged metallic disc nestled in the clouds above Lake Cote, Costa Rica. Our next story suggests that this is an ongoing trend. February 14th, 2010, 45 miles southeast of Santiago, Chile. A family of three arrives near the El Yeso Reservoir for a Sunday picnic in the Andes. It's a beautiful day, so the mother takes 16 pictures of the valley and the sky up above with her digital camera. It isn't until they return home and review the photos that she realizes what she's captured. One of the photos shows the sun shining in the middle of bright white clouds. Above it, to the left, is a band of reddish clouds, and embedded within is a seemingly massive saucer-shaped object. The Chilean government reviewed the photos and shared them with Ted Rowe, who runs the National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena, or NARCAP. He conducted an exhaustive analysis of these photographs.
The photograph contains an anomaly in the upper left-hand quadrant. You see the sun, you see a fluffy layer of cumulus clouds, and then behind them you see a layer of reddish clouds, and embedded in those clouds is what appears to be part of a disk.
The lines you're seeing across this photograph represent separate sections the NARCAP analyst used to record light levels in the photo and determine if the object was solid.
You want to understand how that light is distributed, looking at the red, green, and blue factors primarily, and studying the luminance of the object and of the environment.
Each section is given a number value, and when that data was compared to the surrounding area, here's what NARCAP concluded.
This study resolves that this is in fact an external anomaly. It does not appear to be inserted in the photograph, so we're left with an unidentified aerial phenomenon.
Journalist M.J. Banias notes that Chile is often mentioned as the country with the highest recorded number of UFO sightings. UFO enthusiasts have even claimed this lagoon that lies behind the mountains surrounding the El Yeso Reservoir could be a UFO landing strip.
We have countless other reports of UFO-shaped clouds all over Chile. There's reports out of Sobre, Metacunga, and the Chilean Patagonia. We also have a lot of reports of other UFO sightings around the El Yeso Reservoir.
As for the photo showing an alleged UFO in the clouds,
there's a theory out there that UFOs will hide in clouds or even generate clouds around them to stay hidden from humans.
In January 2023, a similar UFO-shaped cloud shocked residents of a city in Turkey. It hung in the skies for over an hour. What they captured here was a lenticular cloud, which forms when air blows across tall structures like a mountain range and causes vapor to condense in these stunning disc-like shapes. So could the object seen in our Chilean photo have a similar explanation, or is it a genuine UFO? First, are we actually looking at something in the sky or something in the camera? Astronomer and video effects designer Mark D'Antonio has a theory that starts with those strange colors seen in the sky.
These are cirrus clouds. They're ice crystals at high altitude that form in the atmosphere. And sometimes, the way the sun hits them, you get this beautiful prismatic effect. And that's what we're seeing here, in my view. Here's another thing. If we divide the image in half, we have the sun over here and the object over here, and the distance from the center of frame to that object is the same. The likelihood is very small that an object is going to be exactly the same distance away from the center of the frame as the sun, unless you're a lens flare.
Lens flares that can take the form of rings, spheres, starbursts, and other shapes are caused when bright light hits the camera lens, creating artifacts. But meteorologist Juan Hernandez respectfully disagrees with the lens flare theory.
Although I'm not a photography expert, it does not seem like we're looking at a camera artifact. We have this odd orange spot within the clouds. I'm not exactly sure why that would appear in that location. Oftentimes, camera artifacts might look like lines. In this case, we see a blob in the middle of the clouds.
Hernandez explores the notion that what we're seeing could be lenticular clouds, which are commonly mistaken for UFOs.
It's possible to have lenticular clouds in the Andes, but only under certain conditions. And those conditions were not met this specific day. we would be looking for more moisture in the air and faster flow in the wind speed.
For Hernandez, it's the reddish hue that's the biggest mystery.
The likely explanation towards a reddish hue to any cloud would be a setting sun. We obviously don't have a setting sun. It's the middle of the day.
Physicist Matthew Shadagas agrees with Hernandez that this thing is indeed a thing.
The photograph has been studied by UFO experts looking for mundane explanations like nearby aircraft, and they did come up empty for this day and time.
After carefully reviewing the NARCAP report, Shadagas agrees with their findings.
I agree with the conclusion of the NARCAP report, which suggested that this object is truly unidentified. So it's a genuine UFO. That doesn't mean it's an alien spacecraft. It simply means we are unable to identify what it is.
Well, there you have it. We're calling this a genuine UFO. While the Chilean government has yet to comment on the photo, NARCAP has released their 23-page case report to the public. And for more information, you can visit narcap.org. Now we move from the skies of South America to the forests of Middle America. When you think of the Bigfoot's natural habitat, you typically think of the Pacific Northwest. But the video we're about to show you suggests the big fella may have a Midwestern cousin prowling the forests of the Buckeye State. January 12th, 2020, we're in Salt Fork State Park, Ohio. Hiker Nathan Gray and a friend are armed with cameras and drones to document their trek through the woods when they make a startling discovery: the rib cages of several large animals nestled amongst the foliage.
Looks like they're ripped apart pretty good.
The duo continues to explore the area when suddenly they spot this: a creature, large and humanoid, walking through the trees unbothered by or unaware of their presence. Nathan manages to get his camera even closer for a better look. Zooming in, we can see the creature appears to be covered in some type of hair or fur, with lighter, almost white hair around the top of the head.
We had no idea what it was. It was just moseying on along like it didn't have a care in the world.
Field researcher Cliff Barrickman is not at all surprised about where this footage was filmed.
Tons of Bigfoot reports come out of this particular area. Southeastern Ohio, in the area of Salt Fork State Park, is a thick, wooded wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains are no joke, and Ohio is pushed right up against them. Anything out of Southeast Ohio should be looked at very, very closely.
However, in this particular region of the U.S., the locals don't use the name Bigfoot. They call it the Ohio Grassman, based on the large dens it supposedly makes of grass and from its diet, which reportedly consists mainly of tall grass from Ohio fields.
It's the Ohio Grassman.
One of the most infamous sightings was in 1978 when a local family claimed to be haunted by a grassman that was later nicknamed the Minerva Monster.
These people reported large, scary monsters. They would actually stalk them in their home. The family that was reporting these sightings believed that the Sasquatch killed their German Shepherd by snapping its neck. The police themselves came to the conclusion that this was in fact a credible report of something incredible happening.
That sort of violent behavior may explain the bones Nathan and his friend found in the woods. And while it doesn't explain the Grassman sightings from decades ago, Barrickman says there may be another possible explanation for what's in Nathan's video from 2020.
One other theory that's been put forth is that these animals are just normal animals that are being misidentified after the Zanesville massacre.
In 2011, an exotic animal collector released 50 animals into the Ohio woods, including Bengal tigers, lions, cougars, and even a baboon.
But one of the animals that was not killed is a baby grizzly bear. Could this animal here be a survivor of the Zanesville massacre?
The chaos in Zanesville was a catalyst for Ohio's exotic animal ownership laws that went into effect in 2014, which shut down any other potential tiger kings. So is what we're seeing in the video a grizzly, a grassman, or something else? Our experts are tracking the evidence. Wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka dismisses the idea this could be a surviving grizzly.
If this really were a grizzly bear, we would expect to have more reports, fecal samples, bear claw marks, some evidence that a bear is living in that area. And this scene looks really consistent with a human in a costume.
Let's focus on this thing's arms for a moment. Note that all apes have arms longer than their legs, enabling better quadruped movement and efficient brachiation, the ability to swing between trees. But according to anthropologist and Sasquatch expert Jeff Meldrum, we're not seeing anything like that here.
You can see the upper limb is barely to the crotch. That suggests human limb proportions. And the head is kind of large, more like a hood. It looks to me like someone in camo gear with a hoodie and insulated pants and heavy boots on.
Our verdict? It's a hoax. Though you have to give the guys credit for planting those animal bones. Nice try, fellas. The poet John Donne famously wrote, "No man is an island. But what if an island could move like a man?" Take a close look at this next clip. It's July 2021 near the Slingsby Channel in British Columbia, Canada. Storm chaser and explorer George Karunas is traveling in the area, documenting his adventures.
I was representing the Geographical Society of Canada on a boat trip that was traveling around the northern tip of Vancouver Island. It's very remote, nobody lives there, there's no roads, it's a wonderful piece of pristine wilderness.
As he makes his way along the channel, he comes across a small island that seems to have taken on a life of its own.
It was in the Naguato Rapids. It has some of the fastest tidal flow in the world. So the flow of the water changes direction several times a day. And while I'm filming, I'm focusing in on the waves and the rocks.
George's video shows a view of the channel with a small tree-covered islet in the middle. But while the boat appears to float along very slowly, the island rushes past it at an alarming clip.
The island appears to have broken loose and is traveling upstream against the current.
George posts his video online, and everyone who views it joins in on his confusion.
We know that islands don't move. They don't float. They're not boats. They're pieces of land that are sticking up out of the water. Why is this thing on the move?
But journalist Aaron McCarthy says it's not the only island reported to be in motion.
There's also El Ojo, or I Island, in Argentina. It's almost perfectly circular, and it constantly moves and rotates. And according to some sources, locals believe that the circle within a circle is a representation of God on Earth. Other people theorize that is actually covering up a hidden underwater alien base. And that has led believers of this theory to say that that's proof that something otherworldly is at work here.
In addition to islands on the move, there are others that have seemingly just disappeared. Take the strange case of Bermeja, an island that used to be off the coast of Mexico.
Bermeja first began appearing on maps in 1539. But in the late 1990s, and as recently as 2009, when people were out there looking into drilling rights, it became really clear that Bermeja didn't actually exist. There's a conspiracy theory that says the United States or the CIA got rid of the island somehow, because if it existed, it would extend Mexico's territory.
The mysterious moving island George caught on camera is in the fearsome Naguato tidal rapids, which churn at an intense 16 knots. But could these tumultuous tides really be causing the island to move? Our experts weighed in. This video is so bizarre at face value that we asked forensic video analyst Michael Primo to examine if it's even real.
It doesn't appear to be something that was layered using like alpha channeling or green color keying. It is something that is in the scene. We could even verify through testing that this video came from that specific camera through sample CRP testing from the sensor. From what I've seen so far, this recording appears to be authentic.
So then, is it really possible for islands to move? NASA geologist Dr. Bob Anderson says yes.
There are a type of islands that we call tussocks. They're found down in South America where they're dominated by growth. And these plants become so intertwined with each other that they literally form a landmass with water underneath of them. They may not be stable in some areas to walk on, but they are literally an island that can float.
El Ojo is in the middle of marshland, so this is a likely explanation for that apparent landmass. But is George's Island, known as Turret Rock, also a tussock? Anderson says not so fast.
If you look at a boat or a ship going down the water, you're always going to have what's called a bow wave. The wave is going to come up and the boat is cutting through the water. What you see here is not a bow wave. It's actually a recessive wave. And what that means is that the water is literally coming around and going down here.
So if what we're seeing here isn't a wake, why does it look like this rocky mass is moving?
We have to realize that the observer is moving and the camera is moving. Therefore, this thing is an optical illusion. There are three things that you have to worry about. One is the background trees, two is the rock formation, and three is the fact that you yourself are moving.
Kaku says this effect is known as motion parallax.
Now, if you're in a car and you're overtaking another car, the car that you're overtaking goes backwards. And you say to yourself, well, that's not possible. How can a car go backwards in a freeway? It's because the observer is moving. And you have the illusion that the observer is stationary.
And as you can see in this video where the boat is stationary, the same island does not appear to move.
This parallax effect could trick the brain into thinking that something else is going on, because movement is where the mind focuses.
Our verdict? Turret Rock isn't actually moving. It just appears to be because of the motion parallax effect. As for the vanishing island of Bermeja, it likely spawned from a map-making error. But perhaps we'll never know if it really existed. Many cultures around the world have ancient myths and legends of tree-human hybrids. For example, the Jiminju of Japanese mythology is a tree that grows human heads as its fruit. Are such stories just myth, or could it actually be possible for a tree-human hybrid to exist? Before you answer, take a look at this. 2007, Java, Indonesia. American physician Anthony Gaspari travels almost 10,000 miles to meet and examine a new patient, a 35-year-old carpenter who goes by Day Day. The images you're about to see may be disturbing.
Really, the question that I had, because it was so dramatic and there was so much deformity, was this real or was this something that was staged?
These photographs are truly astonishing. This gentleman was given the name Tree Man because of the growths all over his hands and feet. They look like bark, essentially. These patches extend over 6 inches out from his fingers in all directions.
When Dr. Gaspari finally examines Day Day, he quickly realizes his condition is no hoax.
He had difficulty moving, and the first thing that he communicated to me was that he wanted to get better. And so we drew blood, we took specimens, and we brought it back to the United States to be analyzed.
Soon, the whole world shares the doctor's amazement. Wild speculation erupts around what we're actually seeing.
Some people on the internet speculated that this person was half tree, half human, like the Dryad mythology, where a spirit inhabits a tree and makes it move.
People also speculate if it's an infectious condition that could spread.
Some say that this growth reminds them of the fungus made popular in a recent television program. That fungus was based on cordyceps, which is a fungus that grows on and inside of its host and eventually takes over its nervous system and kind of takes control of the animal, turning them into a fungal animal hybrid.
There is certainly anecdotal evidence of humans playing host to plant life. In 2013, a 16-month-old girl in Beijing, China, had a fully developed dandelion growing in her ear that had to be surgically removed. But could some invasive species of vegetation or a fungus live off a person on such a massive scale? Let's see what our experts unearth. We start by addressing the wildest speculation that somehow Day Day was becoming some sort of tree-human hybrid. Anthropologist Kathy Strain is familiar with the worldwide historical myths surrounding these humanoid plant creatures, but says it's a silly theory that contradicts science.
Plants live on carbon dioxide. They breathe it in and exhale oxygen. Humans are the reverse. We breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. And those two cannot be together in the same organism. I do not believe that this photograph represents a true human-plant hybrid.
Physician Ed Hope thinks basic genetics support Strain's opinion.
We share a staggering 50% of our genes with plants. But even this isn't enough for us to produce a hybrid. The animal with the closest common ancestor to humans is the chimpanzee, where we share 98.8% of our genes, and still this isn't enough to produce a hybrid.
So if it's not genetically possible for a person to transform into a plant-human hybrid like in folklore, could a disease or fungus like cordyceps infect a human like in TV shows?
You may have heard of cordyceps within popular science fiction shows, but thankfully for us, it only infects insects. Cordyceps can't grow much above 80 degrees, and our bodies at 97 to 99 degrees are just too hot for it.
Okay, but if it's not a fungus, could it be a plant growing on Day-Day, like that dandelion in the little girl's ear?
In order for tree bark to survive, it has to have a leaf coming off of it that can then take that sunlight for energy. And he has no root system that can go into the ground in order to get water. And so over time, it would die and fall off.
The mystery of Day-Day's condition is finally solved after Dr. Gaspari examines the samples taken back to his lab, putting the tree man myths to rest.
It's a wart virus infection caused by human papillomavirus, which was a result of a severe underlying immune deficiency.
Day-Day's tragic genetic condition is called Lewandowski-Lutz dysplasia.
Only 500 cases ever reported. Unfortunately, there is no known cure.
Our verdict, the rare disease Lewandowski-Lutz dysplasia. Even though there was no cure, surgeries did give Day-Day brief respites from his suffering. At one point, he was even able to wear flip-flops again. Unfortunately, Day-Day succumbed to his illness in 2016. But his fight to get his life back remains an inspiration. So many good things come in pairs. Ears, socks, but UFOs? Take a look at our next sighting, which has one loyal proof viewer seeing double. Memorial Day 2022, Lubbock, Texas. Insurance agent Blake Bednarz is lounging by the pool with his family when he spots something odd. Or more specifically, two somethings flying in the sky above his house. It prompts him to begin recording on his smartphone.
These were unlike anything I've ever seen before. They made no sound whatsoever.
Look closely. The objects appear to fly in perfect formation, at a very tight distance to one another. They coordinate every turn, seeming to anticipate one another's changes.
What's strange is no one said bird. That never came to anyone's mind because of the sheer size. In my opinion, the two objects were about the size of a small Cessna aircraft.
Lubbock, Texas is no stranger to heavy air traffic, both identified and unidentified. Author Amy Teitel explains Lubbock's rich UFO history.
This sighting is happening in the exact same location as one of the most famous UAP sightings in history. The 1951 Lubbock Lights, wherein a large V formation of individual orbs of lights was seen over Lubbock, Texas. These lights were also seen by scientists at the Texas Technical College. They all reported seeing somewhere between 15 and 30 lights floating in the sky in a V-shaped formation.
Another fact to bear in mind, the area is nearby 3 military bases.
Lubbock is very close to multiple military bases in Clovis, Wichita Falls, and Abilene. So it's very possible that this is something that originated from one of those military bases.
Blake is clearly a dogged UFO investigator. In fact, he said he later tried to search for the objects he saw on public flight radar sites, but he came up empty-handed. Will our experts? Let's start with the biggest question. Could Blake have captured an alien spacecraft? Aviation expert Tim McMillan has strong thoughts.
You see wings on both objects. What that tells us is, A, we can rule out spacecraft. Airplanes are designed to fly within the Earth's atmosphere by using gravity and using air currents to generate lift. Now, in the vacuum of space, you don't need wings.
Could it be a military plane then? Online speculation of Blake's footage noted similarities to the T-6 Texan II. It's a plane often used in Air Force training. As you can see by this cockpit footage, instructors use the T-6 to help new pilots get over the fear of flying very close in combat formation. But a T-6 should show up on radar, and remember, Blake's radar data research turned up a whole lot of nada. And McMillan says something else is missing too.
A T-6 is a World War II era propeller plane that is still in use to this day. That wouldn't be what we're looking at because we don't see the tail stabilizers of that aircraft. We're just missing that really key component.
So if it's not a spacecraft and not a typical military fighter, can it just be a pair of large birds soaring, as more than a few online critics insist?
Large birds are very likely what we're seeing here. If you look very closely throughout the video, there are certain portions where you can actually see what appears to be the wings dip and flap slightly, especially towards the corners.
Now consider this. In this footage of soaring white pelicans, you'll see that they do soar in a similar manner to Blake's objects. But notice how often they flap compared to Blake's footage. And when they do flap, it's never with just one wing the way Blake's objects appear to. Plus, the wings on Blake's objects seem extremely rigid. It's this rigidity that has astronomer and video analyst Mark D'Antonio doubting the bird theory.
If those wings don't move, it's possible that we're looking at a pair of drones flying in formation. There is a certain point when they turn to the side. Look where the wings are relative to the back of the body. The wings seem to be further back, and the front seems to be extended. That reminds me of an aircraft rather than a bird. These are definitely human-made. And I know that the military experiments with bird-shaped drones. I've seen them. So this is a possibility.
Our verdict? Bird-shaped drones. We're gonna go with D'Antonio. The motion of the craft is what does it. But did we witness some sort of brand new technology? According to reports, scientists are looking into transforming the bodies of deceased birds into actual flapping wing drones that might enable new ways of spying for military purposes. If you think you've seen one, let us know. Ancient tribes would frequently use animal horns as a way to frighten the enemy. But what's truly frightening about our next video is imagining what type of creature could have been attached to a monstrous horn found on a beach. May 25th, 2020, Sudbrook, Wales. It's low tide on Black Rock Beach, and two net fishermen, Martin and Richard Morgan, are wandering after some unusual weekend storms. All of a sudden, they discover something they believe to be of great importance. Martin pulls out his camera and records this.
We've spotted this poking out of the sand. Pull it out, Rich. See what it is.
Richard begins to gently dig the object from the earth.
Bone, yeah, definitely bone. I'll loose it up, Rich. Suspense is killing me. Look at the size of this. It's a bloody mammoth tusk. I've never in my life seen anything like that. That's thousands of years old.
Mythology is filled with tales of horned creatures, from the Greek Minotaur to the Japanese Oni. But field researcher Ken Gerhardt points to one that is specific to this region.
In terms of the United Kingdom, a mythological creature that a lot of people haven't heard of is called the centaur, or Yale, first described by the ancient Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. He said the Yale was about as large as a horse, black in color, but it had tusks like a wild boar, in addition to very large horns that it could actually rotate independently of each other.
The Yale was used as a symbolic totem of prestige, both for the British royal family and the university that is named after it. And the creatures were believed to perform swashbuckling duels against one another with their rotating horns. Gerhardt suggests another theory, that perhaps we are looking at a long-lost relic of the Ice Age.
We can't discount the possibility that this is the remains of some ancient Pleistocene megafaunal animal, such as a woolly mammoth.
In February of 2022, a plethora of animal bones was discovered on a cave system in Devon, England, just several hours south from where this horn was found. Many researchers theorized that between 30 to 60,000 years ago, there was a sinkhole or pit that trapped unsuspecting animals and dropped them into this cave. The groundbreaking discovery included the bones of a woolly mammoth.
Just mere miles from where this mystery horn was found, there's actually an extensive cave system known as Clearwell Caves. So I think there's a strong possibility that this could be some type of mammoth tusk that was in a cave system and then somehow washed up and was rediscovered just a few miles away.
While the vast majority of woolly mammoths died at the end of the Pleistocene era, there was still a small number that actually stuck around for a few thousand years longer, sharing the earth with human beings. In fact, while King Tut ruled Egypt, mammoths were still roaming around several isolated sections of the globe. Let's see if our experts think this found object could have belonged to one of them. Biologist Floyd Hayes reveals that a mammoth tusk ending up in this muddy terrain is certainly a possibility. He points to the history of the sunken region known as Doggerland.
Doggerland was an area that once connected the British Islands with the mainland of Europe. There were several large mammals that roamed across the British Islands to Eurasia, and one of them was the woolly mammoth. But as the glaciers melted, the sea levels rose, and then there was a tsunami that eroded away the final remnants of Doggerland.
So are we looking at an actual tusk from a prehistoric mammoth that made the journey over what is now the North Sea? Take another look at the evidence.
Mammoth tusks come from the upper incisors, and they normally grow about 8 to 14 feet long. This horn's only about 27 inches long, so it's a little bit too short and bent to be a mammoth.
According to Hayes, the curvature suggests that this couldn't even be a fragment of a much larger mammoth tusk. So what about the mythical Yale? Anthropologist Kathy Strain digs in.
The Yale was known to have these horns that could spin in multiple directions. A horn is bone, and it's attached to your skull. For a bone to move, it has to have a joint, and what you can see at the end of this horn is that it broke off of the skull because it's fully bone and it does not have the ability to move. There is no creature that we know of, either alive or through fossilization, that can have movable horns.
If this isn't a mammoth tusk or a horn from the mythical Yale, we find ourselves on the horns of a dilemma. Just what is this thing?
What I think we are seeing is the horn of an auroch that went extinct back in the 1600s. It was a large cattle that occupied the UK for thousands of years and then went extinct.
The auroch was a colossal, aggressive, and potentially dangerous animal that averaged around 6 feet in height and weighed more than 3,000 pounds, with horns that could grow up to 5 feet in length from tip to tip.
Like many of the megafauna, the auroch went extinct due to the hands of humans. Their horns were very prized as drinking vessels, and so they were often hunted just for their horns and not their meat. It's still a great find, and there's very few of them known, so we're happy that they were able to find this horn.
Our verdict, an auroch horn. The size and location are what nailed it. It seems unbelievable that such a large creature lived alongside humanity for so long. In fact, the auroch was even used to battle gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. I bet the prestigious Yale never got its hands that dirty. We love a good magical sword. Arthur's Excalibur, Bilbo Baggins' Sting, Harry Potter's Sword of Gryffindor. Now, the mysterious sword in our next story doesn't seem to have magical powers, but maybe that's just because no one can read what's inscribed on it. 1825, Lincolnshire, England. An ancient weapon is discovered in the bottom of River Witham. The sword isn't just cool, it's cool AF. On one side is a mysterious inscription made by gold wire that has been inlaid into the steel with this strange group of letters. What do they mean? The British Library, where the sword resides, has been so puzzled by the inscription, it's requested help in cracking the seemingly incomprehensible code.
The sword itself is very impressive. It has a gold inlay, which is incredibly rare. But the Museum of London, with all the resources and the people that they've had to study it, still nobody knows exactly what it says.
Journalist Eric Grunhauser takes a stab at some theories that have been offered, starting with the famous Knights Templar.
The Knights Templar, in their distinctive white mantles and red cross, were one of the most fearsome fighting forces of the Crusades.
Mysterious stories surrounding the Knights Templar continue to this day. Chief among them, the hotly contested claim that their mission was to protect the Holy Grail and the alleged bloodline of Jesus Christ. Many speculate that they communicated in their own secret code known as the Templar Cipher.
Is this possibly code left over from the Knights Templar? Or maybe even an incantation meant to imbue the blade and its user with unearthly powers?
But another theory says this sword may go back much further.
According to the legends, there was a prince named Siegfried, or Sigurd, who lived near the Rhine River in Germany. And he needed to slay the dragon Fafnir. And Sigurd needed a mythic blade and found it in the sword named Gram. With Gram, Sigurd slayed Fafnir and bathed in the dragon's blood, making himself invincible.
Siegfried and Sigurd are names for the same hero who shows up in both Germanic and Norse tales from old. The difference with Sigurd, however, is that he may have actually been real.
The legends of Sigurd may have been based on real historical figures, specifically kings from the Merovingian dynasty. Researchers have said that the sword was actually forged in Germany. So could this be the legendary Gram?
Germany, like much of North and Central Europe, was often a mishmash of ethnicities that invaded and intermingled with each other for centuries. The Norsemen were all over the place, and many stashes of weapons that they left behind have been discovered all over the UK, which could explain how such a sword ended up here.
Some think that the inscription was meant to enchant the blade and give power to both the blade itself and its user.
The Norse Vikings were big believers in this, frequently carving the runic letter for TR, the Norse god of war, onto their swords and shields for a supposed magical assist on the battleground. The Germanic people are thought to have originated from a small area of Scandinavia during the 4th century BC. So the Norse Vikings were technically Germanic and even share some mythologies. Let's see if our experts can determine if this sword is part of a myth, a legend, or none of the above. Archaeologist and anthropologist Kathy Strange shoots down the Norse mythology theory by pointing to one particular symbol that would never have appeared on Sigurd's sword, Gram.
There are symbols of crosses on the sword, and those symbols are definitely Christian. However, the Vikings practiced polytheism, meaning they worshiped many gods. Christianity worshiped one god. And so because of the Christian symbols that are on the sword, we can safely rule out that this is Gram, the well-known sword.
Archaeologist Ed Barnhart agrees with Strain's observation that this inscription is most certainly reflective of Christian faith.
It's a series of Latin characters that don't spell out a single word. Instead, they are the initials of a much longer statement. The first two letters are ND, which is probably Nostras Domini, which is our Lord. The next three are XO, X, that meant the Holy Trinity. So the first few letters do seem like the opening of a Christian prayer.
So could this sword be associated with the Knights Templar? Barnhart believes so.
The inscription is bracketed by two Christian crosses of very specific design, the very cross of the Knights Templar, which says that either it was a gift from the Knights Templar or it was used by Knights Templar themselves.
And as for those inscriptions giving the sword magic powers,
by the time we come into Christianity's dominance of Europe, they're now using that same thing, but it's the magical power of God inscribed on the sword in the language of the day, which was Latin. And the theory is that by throwing them into the river, they were returning them back to the magical powers of God and nature.
Begin
begins not with certainty but with the hum of anticipation, the kind that lives in the chest when a question refuses to stay quiet, and I wanted this story to feel like that from its first breath, a long unbroken inhale where evidence, doubt, memory, and human hunger for meaning fold into one another as the camera of imagination drifts over the Andes at dusk. Jagged spines cutting the sky while a retired pilot named Mateo Alvarez watches a light move against the wind in a way he knows aircraft do not, and even though this narrative is inspired by the investigative spirit of the proof is out there, it is also a meditation on how proof is filtered through people, through fear, through longing, through the echo of a lifetime of looking up, and so we follow Mateo as he recalls the night in meticulous fragments, the altitude, the temperature, the tremor in his hands not from age but from recognition. Because recognition is sometimes more frightening than surprise, and as his testimony is replayed in studios and living rooms far from the mountains, it becomes a spark that leaps continents, igniting debates in Ohio basements where amateur astronomers gather, in online forums where skepticism sharpens like a blade, and in the quiet office of a producer who believes that truth is not found by shouting but by listening long enough for patterns to emerge. And in this first part 1, let the story breathe slowly, lingering on the texture of investigation, the weight of silence between questions, the way a single video clip can be paused and enlarged until pixels resemble constellations of their own, each one demanding interpretation, because the proof is never just out there in the sky, it is also in the spaces between people, in how they argue, concede, defend, and revise, and so when the footage from the Andes circulates, slowed frame by frame, the object's movement appears to defy conventional propulsion, not because it is impossible but because it refuses to behave politely, and that refusal becomes the engine of narrative tension, mirrored by a second thread unfolding in Ohio where a grainy nighttime recording of a hovering shape above a cornfield resurfaces from years past, labeled a hoax by some and a misidentified drone by others, yet stubbornly unresolved. And I interweave these threads to show how distance collapses under curiosity, how the Andes and the Midwest become neighboring rooms in the same house of inquiry, and as experts weigh in, an aerospace engineer tracing vectors on a digital overlay, a meteorologist dismissing weather anomalies with practiced confidence, a former intelligence analyst choosing words carefully, the reader senses that each explanation is also a confession of limits, because expertise does not erase mystery, it frames it, and framing is an act of power, one that the series, and this novelistic retelling, examines with care, never accusing, always asking, and the asking becomes almost musical, a rhythm that carries us deeper into character, into the producer's memory of childhood nights staring at the sky, into Mateo's marriage strained by his insistence on telling a story others urge him to forget, into an Ohio farmer's reluctance to speak after ridicule taught him the cost of honesty, and through all this I avoid the easy thrill of revelation, choosing instead the slow burn of accumulation, because the most unsettling truths are rarely sudden, they seep, and as part 1 stretches forward without pause, like a single unbroken shot, it mirrors the experience of watching evidence unfold in real time, no edits to reassure us, no narration to tell us what to think, only the steady insistence that something happened and that understanding it requires patience, humility, and the courage to sit with ambiguity, and even as I allow myself to invent connective tissue, imagined conversations, private doubts, the ethical spine of the story remains aligned with the standards of responsible inquiry, no sensationalism, no harm, only the recognition that wondering about the unknown is a profoundly human act, And that humanity is what binds these disparate sightings into a single narrative pulse, a pulse that beats louder as the episode within the story draws to a close, leaving questions deliberately unanswered, leaving the light over the Andes still moving in memory, leaving Ohio's grainy sky unresolved, and inviting the reader, as the show invites its viewers, to lean forward rather than lean away. To consider that proof may not be a destination but a process, one that begins here, in this long first movement, and continues only if we are willing to keep watching, keep thinking, keep asking. Part 2 flows forward without pause, widening the lens while tightening the pressure, because once a question is aired it develops gravity, pulling in lives that never volunteered to orbit it, and so the narrative resumes with the Andes footage no longer a solitary curiosity but a contested artifact, dissected on monitors where analysts scrub timelines and annotate vectors. While in Ohio the old recording acquires new context as a former local news intern, now middle-aged and cautious, admits. He was instructed years ago to shelve the story after a quiet call from a regional authority, a detail that does not prove conspiracy but introduces friction, and friction is where heat is generated, and heat is what drives this part of the story as it shifts between the controlled calm of studios and the messy interiors of human reaction. Following Mateo as he travels to a city he has not visited since his aviation days, sitting beneath lights that flatten nuance while producers ask him to repeat his account with identical phrasing, something memory resists, because memory is fluid, and each retelling subtly reshapes the event, which skeptics seize upon as weakness while believers recognize it as honesty, and this tension becomes thematic, explored through imagined but plausible conversations between experts who disagree not out of malice but methodology. One insisting on eliminating all known variables before entertaining the unknown, another arguing that anomalies exist precisely because frameworks are incomplete, and I let these voices overlap, not interrupting one another but coexisting in a single paragraph as the reader experiences the same cognitive overload viewers feel when confronted with too many interpretations at once. And parallel to this public debate runs a quieter thread in Ohio, where the farmer whose footage resurfaced watches his name trend briefly online, the attention reopening old wounds, reminding him of laughter at town halls and the loneliness of being dismissed, and through him the story explores the social cost of anomaly, how communities police normalcy, and how deviation invites correction, ridicule, or silence. And as investigators re-examine his video with tools unavailable a decade earlier, discovering inconsistencies that rule out some explanations while failing to confirm others, the narrative refuses to resolve neatly, instead emphasizing process, the slow grind of elimination, the humility of saying we do not know, and that humility contrasts sharply with the certainty demanded by audiences who want answers packaged cleanly, and this demand pressures the producer character, who wrestles internally with the ethics of storytelling, remembering past episodes where ambiguity was criticized as weakness, yet believing that integrity lies in resisting the urge to overstate, and this inner conflict is rendered through sensory detail, the hum of servers, the glow of paused frames, the weight of headphones pressing against ears late at night, while outside the city continues indifferent, unaware that inside a building questions about the universe are being negotiated line by line, and as Part 2 deepens, it introduces a historical echo, a brief but dense recollection of earlier sightings over mountain ranges and rural fields, not as proof but as pattern, suggesting that geography and isolation may play roles in perception, or perhaps an opportunity, and the Andes themselves become almost a Character, ancient, patient, having watched countless lights cross their skies long before cameras existed, and this perspective dilates time, reminding the reader that human documentation is recent, that mystery predates us, and that realization unsettles both skeptics and believers, because it implies that answers may not be forthcoming on our preferred timelines, and yet the narrative never drifts into fatalism, instead grounding itself again in the present as a new analysis challenges a popular debunking theory, showing that atmospheric explanations fail to account for abrupt directional changes, a revelation that excites some and alarms others, and the Ohio footage, when synchronized with regional flight data, reveals an absence where something should be, a gap that cannot be filled easily, and it is in these gaps that imagination strains, but the story is careful to show restraint, emphasizing responsible speculation over sensational leap. Aligning with the spirit of the proof is out there by dramatizing investigation rather than conclusion, and emotionally the part crescendos not with discovery but with division, as online discourse fractures into camps, as Mateo receives messages ranging from gratitude to threats, as the farmer considers retreating again into silence, and as the producer must decide whether to air an update that admits uncertainty, knowing it may disappoint, and the paragraph presses on, sentence after sentence, mirroring the relentlessness of inquiry, until it settles into a moment of quiet, a scene where Mateo stands alone on a hotel balcony looking at a city sky washed pale by light pollution, realizing that whatever he saw over the Andes has changed his relationship with the unknown forever, because once you accept that something may exist beyond your understanding, you cannot unaccept it, and that acceptance is both burden and gift, and as this part closes, the narrative leaves multiple threads taut, evidence incomplete, emotions raw, questions multiplying rather than shrinking, reinforcing the central idea that proof is not a switch to be flipped, but a path to be walked, often without clear signage, and it invites the reader to continue walking, to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, and to step forward into the next phase of the investigation and the lives it touches. Part 3 refuses to slow down, instead it sinks deeper, because by now the investigation has momentum and momentum changes people, and the story continues as the Andes footage and the Ohio case become reference points rather than isolated mysteries, anchors around which new testimonies begin to cluster, not because the sky has suddenly changed but because attention has, and attention is a catalyst, drawing out voices that had learned to stay quiet, and I follow this ripple outward, first to a coastal radar technician who contacts the producers anonymously, describing an unexplained track recorded years earlier that behaved with the same abrupt lateral shifts seen in the mountain video, and his reluctance is palpable even through mediated dialogue, his words clipped, cautious, shaped by institutional culture that rewards certainty and punishes deviation. And through him the narrative explores how data itself can become a liability, how an anomalous blip is not just an error to be corrected but a potential threat to credibility, career, identity, and as his account is verified in fragments, timestamps aligning imperfectly but suggestively with other reports, the investigation grows heavier, no longer just about images but about systems, about what gets recorded, what gets ignored, and why, and parallel to this, in Ohio, the farmer finally agrees to a longer interview, one not filmed under studio lights but in his own kitchen, and the domestic setting matters, because truth spoken where one lives carries a different texture, and I let the narrative linger on ordinary details, the scrape of a chair, the smell of coffee, the way his hands move unconsciously as he talks, grounding the extraordinary within the mundane, emphasizing that sightings do not happen to archetypes but to people with routines and bills and memories, and as he recounts the night again, small differences emerge. Not contradictions but clarifications, the soundlessness of the object, the Way animals reacted, details dismissed before as irrelevant now re-examined with care, and experts debate these elements, some pointing out that silence can be deceptive at distance, others noting patterns in animal behavior reported globally, and again the story resists resolution, instead layering complexity, because complexity is more honest than closure, and at the same time, the producer faces external pressure as network executives question audience fatigue, asking when answers will arrive. And this introduces a meta layer to the narrative, a commentary on modern consumption of mystery, where patience is scarce and ambiguity is often framed as failure, and I explore this through internal monologue, the producer recalling early seasons of investigative television when unanswered questions were acceptable, even celebrated, contrasted with the current climate where certainty is demanded even when it is artificial, and this tension informs editorial decisions that shape what the public sees, reminding the reader that proof is mediated not just by science but by storytelling structures, and as Part 3 unfolds, a new angle emerges through an atmospheric physicist who proposes a rare but natural explanation for the Andes object, one involving plasma formations under specific geomagnetic conditions, and for a moment the narrative leans into this possibility, detailing the science with respect and clarity, showing how such phenomena could produce light, motion, and apparent intelligence without agency, and this is important because it demonstrates the investigation's good faith, its willingness to embrace explanations that diminish the extraordinary, yet even here cracks appear, because the data does not align perfectly, altitude discrepancies persist, movement patterns remain partially unaccounted for, and the physicist herself admits the model is incomplete. And that admission becomes a quiet but powerful moment, illustrating scientific integrity not as omniscience but as openness to revision, and emotionally this affects Matteo deeply, because he wants an answer that restores order, that allows him to categorize his experience without feeling foolish or naive, and I follow him as he watches the segment alone, pausing it repeatedly, hoping the explanation will settle something inside him, only to realize that uncertainty has already taken root too deeply, and that realization mirrors the audience's journey, because by now the story is less about whether the objects were extraterrestrial and more about how humans respond when confronted with limits of knowledge, and the Ohio farmer experiences a parallel shift, moving from defensiveness to curiosity, beginning to read about optics, drones, experimental aircraft, not to disprove himself but to understand the ecosystem of explanations, and this self-education empowers him, transforming him from subject to participant, a subtle but meaningful evolution. And as online discourse continues to polarize, the narrative steps back to observe patterns, how belief and skepticism often speak past each other, how algorithms amplify certainty over nuance, and how fear, both of ridicule and of the unknown, shapes discourse more than evidence alone, and this sociological lens deepens the novelistic adaptation, aligning with the investigative ethos while expanding into reflection, and midway through this long movement, a setback occurs when a supposed breakthrough video is revealed to be manipulated, and the investigation addresses this head-on, dissecting the hoax publicly, explaining how it was detected, and emphasizing that false evidence harms legitimate inquiry, and this moment reinforces ethical boundaries, underscoring that the pursuit of truth includes rejecting convenient but flawed data, even when it excites, and the fallout from this debunking ripples outward, skeptics feeling vindicated, believers feeling betrayed, and moderates feeling exhausted, and the story captures this emotional whiplash. The way hope and disappointment cycle rapidly in modern information environments. And as Part 3 approaches its closing stretch, attention returns to the Andes, where a follow-up expedition is planned, not as a spectacle but as methodical fieldwork, and the description of preparation is meticulous: equipment lists, altitude considerations, coordination with local authorities, conveying seriousness, and Mateo's involvement is limited but symbolically important. His testimony guiding locations, his presence lending continuity between past and present, and the Andes again loom large, silent witnesses to human inquiry, and the paragraph presses forward, unbroken, mirroring the sustained effort required to pursue answers responsibly, until it reaches a moment of suspended anticipation, the team standing beneath a vast night sky, instruments ready, not expecting revelation but open to observation, and the narrative pauses there, not ending but holding, emphasizing that investigation is an ongoing act, and that sometimes the most honest place to stop is at the edge of what we can currently know, inviting continuation not because a cliffhanger demands it, but because curiosity does, and the story, like the series that inspires it, trusts the audience to follow that curiosity into deeper uncertainty rather than away from it. Part 4 advances without hesitation, stretching the narrative across geography, data, and inner reckoning, because once the expedition to the Andes begins, the story is no longer about footage alone but about presence, about what it means to stand where something inexplicable was witnessed and to confront the difference between memory and terrain. And so the paragraph opens with altitude, thin air pressing against lungs, instruments calibrated repeatedly because error margins shrink as conditions grow harsher, and the team's movements are deliberate, almost reverent, as if speed itself might offend the mountains. And I let the Andes dominate the prose here, not romantically but physically, describing how sound carries strangely, how lights appear closer than they are, how shadows behave unpredictably at night, all of which complicates interpretation and retroactively reframes Mateo's original sighting, adding layers without diminishing its impact. And as sensors are deployed and cameras aligned, the investigation intersects with local voices, guides who speak of unusual lights with neither awe nor fear but familiarity, stories passed casually, unremarkable in their telling, which unsettles the outsiders more than any dramatic claim could, because normalization of anomaly suggests either long misunderstanding or long coexistence, and that possibility hangs unspoken. And parallel to this fieldwork, the Ohio thread continues, now quieter but deeper, as the farmer participates remotely in discussions with analysts, his confidence growing as he learns the language of inquiry, terms once alien now tools, and this empowerment subtly shifts power dynamics, illustrating that investigation is not owned by institutions alone, and the producer, observing this evolution, reflects on the unintended consequences of the show, how it has created communities of amateur rigor alongside echo chambers of belief, and this ambivalence is explored honestly, without self-congratulation, acknowledging responsibility without assuming control, and midway through the paragraph a pivotal moment occurs when one of the Andes instruments records a brief anomaly, not visually dramatic but statistically curious, a spike that does not repeat, and the team responds not with excitement but protocol, documenting, cross-checking, resisting narrative temptation. And this restraint is emphasized as virtue, contrasting sharply with online speculation that immediately inflates the event, demonstrating the widening gap between process and perception, and Mateo's reaction to this moment is inward, a quiet mix of validation and frustration, because the data neither confirms nor denies his experience, instead situating it within probability, and probability, the story suggests, can be emotionally unsatisfying even when intellectually honest. And as night deepens, the expedition yields no spectacle, only silence and stars, and that absence becomes meaningful, forcing Characters and readers alike to confront expectations shaped by media rather than reality, and the narrative uses this to question why revelation is assumed to be repeatable on demand, why mystery is expected to perform, and in Ohio a similar reckoning unfolds when renewed analysis of flight data definitively rules out several favored explanations, narrowing the field without closing it. And this narrowing intensifies debate rather than calming it, illustrating that ambiguity under pressure can polarize more than ignorance. And throughout Part 4 I weave in reflections on historical investigations, not as parallels but as cautionary tales, reminding that many past mysteries were eventually explained through patient accumulation rather than singular discovery, and that patience is culturally endangered. And the producer's internal struggle crescendos here as deadlines loom and executives push for narrative payoff, and the decision is made to air the Andes expedition as it happened. Incomplete, unresolved, an editorial gamble that prioritizes integrity over ratings, and this choice becomes a thematic fulcrum, suggesting that how a story is told can be as consequential as what it claims, and the broadcast's reception is mixed, some praising honesty, others accusing evasion, and this feedback loop feeds back into the character's sense of purpose, testing commitment, and as the paragraph drives forward it returns once more to the mountains at dawn, light revealing nothing extraordinary yet transforming everything, and Mateo realizes that his need for explanation has softened into acceptance of inquiry itself, a subtle but profound shift, mirrored by the Ohio farmer who now speaks publicly not to convince but to contribute, and by the producer who accepts that unanswered questions may be the most truthful outcome. And Part 4 closes not with an image of the sky but with an image of people, scattered yet connected by curiosity, continuing to look, to measure, to argue, to doubt, and to hope, reinforcing that the proof, whatever it may ultimately be, is inseparable from the human willingness to pursue it responsibly, even when certainty remains out of reach. Part 5 deepens rather than expands, turning inward even as the investigation outwardly continues, because after spectacle fails to appear the real movement happens inside the people bound to the question, and the narrative resonates with the aftermath of the Andes broadcast, the quiet after transmission where reactions arrive not as applause but as messages, essays, rebuttals, long threads dissecting tone and implication. And I follow the producer as he reads them late at night, realizing that the audience has begun to mirror the investigation itself, fractured into methods rather than conclusions, some valuing restraint, others craving declaration, and this reflection reframes the entire project, shifting its center from phenomena to epistemology, from what is seen to how seeing is processed, and that shift ripples through every character. Mateo returning home with a sense of unfinished business that no longer feels like failure but like responsibility, compelled now to speak not as a witness seeking validation but as a participant in an ongoing cultural conversation about uncertainty, and his interactions with former colleagues reveal generational divides, older pilots clinging to strict taxonomies, younger ones more comfortable with ambiguity, suggesting that openness to the unknown may correlate less with evidence than with worldview. And in Ohio the farmer experiences an unexpected transformation as well, invited to speak at a local college not as a curiosity but as a case study in citizen observation, and this invitation reframes his experience from ridicule to relevance, a powerful narrative turn that underscores the democratization of inquiry when handled ethically, and as he stands before students explaining not what he believes but what he recorded and how it felt to be dismissed, the story highlights empathy as an underappreciated component of investigation, because data divorced from human context risks distortion, and experts watching remotely Comment not on the sighting itself but on the clarity with which lived experience is articulated, and this feeds back into the producer's evolving philosophy, prompting a segment that focuses explicitly on process, on how claims are evaluated, how bias operates on all sides, and how uncertainty can be communicated without surrendering rigor, and this meta-segment becomes controversial. Accused by some of evading the central mystery, yet defended by others as essential groundwork, and I let these debates unfold within the paragraph, overlapping voices, quoted fragments, reactions bleeding into one another, mimicking the information environment itself, and midway through Part 5 a subtle but important development occurs when a previously skeptical aerospace analyst revises a public statement, acknowledging that while no extraordinary explanation is warranted, certain flight characteristics observed in both the Andes and Ohio cases remain anomalous within known civilian frameworks. A careful, conditional admission that excites neither camp fully but advances the conversation incrementally, and the narrative treats this not as triumph but as progress, illustrating that movement in serious inquiry often appears anticlimactic, and Mateo responds to this with a quiet satisfaction, not because it proves him right but because it validates patience, and patience emerges here as a thematic anchor, contrasted against the rapid cycles of outrage and enthusiasm online, and as Part 5 continues, attention shifts briefly to international response, small investigative groups in other countries re-examining old cases with renewed methodological rigor inspired by the show's transparency, suggesting cultural impact beyond ratings, and this expansion hints at a global network of curiosity forming, decentralized, uneven, but earnest, and the producer grapples with the weight of that influence, recognizing that storytelling choices can encourage either critical thinking or credulity, and this awareness tempers future decisions, and the paragraph lingers on moments of doubt as well. When fatigue sets in, when characters wonder whether endless questioning leads anywhere meaningful, and these doubts are not dismissed but acknowledged as part of the cost of sustained inquiry, and the Andes reappear not as a site of mystery but as memory, Mateo dreaming of the light again, altered by time, less vivid but more symbolic, representing not an object but a turning point in his understanding of certainty. And as dawn breaks in Ohio on an ordinary morning, the farmer goes about his routine with a lighter step, having reclaimed agency over his narrative, and the story weaves these personal resolutions together without claiming closure, emphasizing continuity over conclusion, and Part 5 closes with a deliberate reframing, the producer articulating in voiceover that proof is not a verdict but a discipline, a commitment to asking better questions over time, and this statement, understated and careful, encapsulates the evolving heart of the narrative, inviting the reader to adjust expectations, to value the slow accrual of understanding over the thrill of revelation, and to recognize that the unknown does not diminish humanity but challenges it to mature intellectually, and the paragraph ends not with mystery intensifying but with perspective widening, setting the stage for the next movement where consequences, rather than sightings, will take center stage. Part 6 unfolds as a sustained examination of consequence rather than phenomenon, because by now the lights in the sky have receded slightly and what remains illuminated is the human terrain altered by prolonged exposure to uncertainty, and the narrative resumes in the weeks following the methodological episode, when the ripple effects become measurable not in sightings but in behavior, language, and institutional posture, and I follow the producer as he attends an academic conference where the series is discussed not as entertainment but as a case study in public-facing inquiry, a surreal shift that underscores how stories escape their creators, and the conversations he overhears are precise, sometimes critical, sometimes generous, focusing on epistemic responsibility, on how presenting unresolved anomalies can either empower audiences or entrench belief systems depending on framing. And this feedback unsettles him productively, sharpening his awareness that neutrality is not absence of influence but a stance requiring constant calibration, and this awareness feeds into the broader narrative as Mateo experiences a parallel reckoning when he is invited to speak at an aviation safety symposium, a space where speculation is unwelcome and discipline reigns, and there he chooses his words carefully, describing his sighting not as an intrusion of the extraordinary but as an operational anomaly, a term that reframes the experience within professional norms, and this reframing earns him respect rather than dismissal, illustrating how language mediates legitimacy, and through this I explore how many anomalous experiences may be buried not because they are false but because they are expressed in vocabularies that trigger resistance. And in Ohio, the farmer encounters a similar linguistic shift as he collaborates with a small team of students to reconstruct his footage using updated modeling software, the work slow and iterative, producing no definitive answer, but improving resolution of uncertainty, and this process becomes therapeutic, transforming his experience from static memory into active project, and the narrative lingers on the patience required, the frustration of incremental gains, emphasizing that genuine inquiry often feels anticlimactic in motion even when meaningful in retrospect, and as these individual arcs progress, institutional response begins to surface more clearly, with aviation authorities issuing a carefully worded statement acknowledging the value of standardized reporting for unidentified aerial phenomena without endorsing extraordinary explanations, a bureaucratic milestone that satisfies few but signals cultural shift, and the story treats this moment with measured attention, noting how incremental acknowledgement can matter more than dramatic disclosure, and this theme of incrementalism threads through Part 6. Contrasting sharply with popular narratives of sudden revelation, and the producer reflects on this dissonance as social media reacts to the statement with polarized intensity, some celebrating transparency, others condemning vagueness, and he recognizes that for many, ambiguity feels like threat, not opportunity, and this recognition informs a new editorial approach that foregrounds uncertainty as stable rather than temporary, a condition to be managed rather than eradicated. And this philosophical pivot is mirrored emotionally by Mateo, who now dreams less of the object itself and more of the moment he chose to speak publicly, realizing that the sighting's significance lies less in what it was than in what it compelled him to become, a man willing to tolerate doubt without retreating into silence or certainty, and the Ohio farmer undergoes a quieter but equally profound shift as he mentors another witness from a neighboring county, someone reluctant to come forward. And in offering guidance he recognizes how far he has traveled from fear to stewardship, and this mentorship motif expands outward as the narrative introduces a network of informal support forming among witnesses, investigators, and skeptics willing to engage respectfully, a fragile ecosystem sustained by norms rather than authority, and I explore the vulnerability of this ecosystem, how easily it can be destabilized by sensationalism or bad faith, and how its survival depends on shared commitment to rigor and empathy. And midway through Part 6 the narrative confronts a crisis when a prominent commentator accuses the series of deliberately withholding evidence, a claim unfounded but amplified, and the response becomes a test of principles, as the producer chooses transparency over defensiveness, releasing raw data and methodological notes, inviting scrutiny rather than rebuttal, and this act, while risky, reinforces the series' credibility among serious observers even as it alienates those seeking affirmation rather than process, and the story does not shy away from the personal toll of this decision. The stress, the exhaustion, the quiet doubt that accompanies ethical choices lacking immediate reward, and Mateo observes this from a distance, recognizing parallels with his own experience of being doubted, and reaching out in solidarity, a gesture that symbolizes the unexpected alliances forged through shared uncertainty, and as Part 6 advances it broadens temporally, reflecting on how future audiences may interpret these episodes differently, with access to new frameworks or technologies. And this temporal humility becomes a guiding principle, acknowledging that present conclusions are provisional by necessity, and this acknowledgement softens the urgency that once drove the investigation, replacing it with steadiness, and the Andes and Ohio recede into symbolic coordinates rather than active sites, markers of origin rather than destinations, and the paragraph lingers on quiet scenes. The producer walking home through a city no longer buzzing with revelation but alive with ordinary complexity, Mateo flying as a passenger and watching clouds without scanning for anomalies, the farmer tending fields under a sky that is once again simply sky, and these scenes are not retreats from inquiry but integrations, demonstrating that living with unanswered questions does not require constant vigilance, only openness, and as the narrative approaches its close, it articulates a matured thesis, that proof, when pursued honestly, reshapes those who seek it more than it resolves what is sought, and that this reshaping is not failure but outcome, and Part 6 ends on a note of equilibrium rather than suspense, a sense that the investigation has entered a new phase defined less by discovery than by practice, less by objects than by ethics, inviting continuation not through promise of revelation but through commitment to the discipline that has been forged, suggesting that what follows will test not what is known but how steadfastly that discipline can be maintained under new pressures and possibilities. Part 7 advances into a phase where steadiness is tested by renewal, because inquiry never truly rests, it only pauses until context shifts, and the narrative resumes months later when a subtle change in the informational climate reactivates dormant tensions, not through a dramatic new sighting but through reclassification, as a tranche of previously restricted historical reports is quietly released, dense, technical, unadorned, and instantly misread by those hungry for confirmation, and the producer finds himself once again navigating the gap between documentation and interpretation, aware that transparency without literacy can inflame rather than clarify, and this awareness pulls the story back into motion as he convenes a diverse advisory group, skeptics, scientists, communicators, not to chase spectacle but to contextualize the material responsibly. And the narrative lingers on their discussions, meticulous, sometimes tedious, because real rigor often is, emphasizing that meaning emerges not from isolated lines but from patterns across years, and as these documents are parsed, the Andes and Ohio cases resurface as reference points, no longer central but illustrative, examples within a broader mosaic of unresolved but bounded anomalies, and this reframing subtly shifts the emotional tone, reducing personal stakes while elevating collective responsibility. And Mateo observes this shift with mixed feelings, relieved that his experience is no longer singularly exposed yet aware that dilution can feel like erasure, and through him the story examines the human desire for narrative centrality, the need to matter within a story larger than oneself, and his journey now involves releasing that need, accepting that his sightings' value lies in contribution rather than prominence, and this acceptance is neither easy nor final, unfolding through conversations with his family who have lived alongside the investigation's shadow, reminding him that meaning is negotiated relationally, not claimed unilaterally, and in Ohio the farmer experiences a parallel recalibration as public attention wanes, invitations slow, and ordinary life reasserts itself, and rather than feeling abandoned he discovers a quiet satisfaction in continuity, having integrated the experience into identity without allowing it to dominate. And this integration is portrayed through small acts, teaching, mentoring, documenting, all unremarkable yet sustaining, and the narrative emphasizes that mature inquiry often produces caretakers rather than crusaders, and as Part 7 unfolds, the external world intrudes again when a sensational media outlet publishes a distorted summary of the released documents, igniting a brief but intense cycle of outrage, and the response from the investigative community becomes a litmus test for the norms established earlier, with some reacting defensively, others choosing silence, and the producer opts for measured clarification. Resisting the temptation to amplify misinformation by confronting it directly, and this restraint frustrates audiences conditioned to conflict, but the story frames it as growth, as an evolution from reactive posture to principled consistency, and this decision influences others, establishing a precedent for how future distortions are handled, and this collective behavioral shift is subtle but significant, suggesting cultural learning, and the narrative explores how such learning is fragile, requiring reinforcement, vulnerable to fatigue, and dependent on trust built slowly over time. And amid this, a new personal arc emerges when the coastal radar technician from earlier parts decides to step forward publicly, no longer anonymous, motivated not by revelation but by solidarity, and his testimony adds nothing sensational but reinforces patterns of institutional hesitation. And the story treats his decision with gravity, acknowledging the risk and the quiet courage involved, and Mateo reaches out to him, their conversation understated, mutual recognition without grandiosity, reinforcing the theme that community among witnesses often forms around shared restraint rather than shared belief, and as these interpersonal networks strengthen, the narrative broadens to consider long-term implications, how standardized reporting protocols begin to change professional culture incrementally, how younger practitioners are trained to document anomalies without stigma, and how this cultural shift may, over decades, produce clearer data, not because phenomena increase but because fear decreases, and this long-view perspective tempers urgency, positioning the investigation as intergenerational rather than episodic, and the producer reflects on this temporal expansion, recognizing that the story he is telling now may not resolve within his career, and this recognition frees him from performative closure, allowing a more patient narrative stance. And Part 7 uses this freedom to linger on moments of ordinary coexistence with uncertainty, scenes where characters live full lives without constant reference to the unknown, demonstrating that curiosity need not consume, and this balance becomes aspirational, a model rather than an endpoint, and yet the story does not idealize equilibrium, acknowledging moments when doubt resurfaces, when old footage is revisited compulsively, when new rumors spark familiar adrenaline. And these relapses are portrayed not as failures but as reminders that uncertainty is dynamic, requiring ongoing negotiation, and the paragraph presses forward through these oscillations, mirroring the rhythm of inquiry itself, advancing, receding, stabilizing, and advancing again, and as Part 7 approaches its close, attention returns briefly to the sky, not as a site of expectation but as context, a shared backdrop against which human meaning-making unfolds, and the narrative describes a night where nothing happens, no lights, no anomalies, just stars. And this ordinariness is given weight, suggesting that absence can be as instructive as presence, teaching patience, perspective, and humility, and the characters, scattered across continents, experience this same sky differently yet simultaneously, united not by belief but by attentiveness, and the paragraph ends on this quiet simultaneity, reinforcing that the investigation has become less about chasing proof and more about cultivating a way of looking that endures beyond episodes, beyond headlines, and beyond individual experiences, setting the stage for the next movement where the accumulated Discipline will face its most challenging test, not from the unknown itself but from how the known world chooses to respond. Part 8 unfolds as the most fragile chapter yet, not because new anomalies appear but because the accumulated discipline of inquiry is finally confronted by forces that care little for patience or nuance, and the narrative resonates when the investigative framework, so carefully built across months of restraint, is appropriated by external interests seeking validation rather than understanding. A shift that tests whether the culture that has formed around responsible questioning can withstand distortion from within, and I follow the producer as he becomes aware that fragments of methodology, once shared openly to encourage literacy, are now being selectively quoted to legitimize predetermined conclusions, a misuse subtle enough to evade outright falsehood yet corrosive in effect. And this realization marks a turning point, because it reveals that transparency alone is insufficient without shared values. And the story leans into this discomfort, refusing to simplify it into villains and heroes, instead examining how even good faith tools can be repurposed when context is stripped away, and this tension reverberates outward as Mateo is contacted by a group claiming his sighting as definitive evidence for claims he does not endorse, forcing him into the unfamiliar role of boundary setter, and his response is careful, measured, publicly clarifying what his experience can and cannot support. A stance that costs him allies who preferred certainty over accuracy, and through this loss the narrative explores the loneliness of integrity, the quiet isolation that accompanies refusal to be instrumentalized, and in Ohio the farmer encounters a parallel challenge when his footage is incorporated into a viral compilation divorced from analysis, prompting him to confront the limits of consent in the digital age, and his decision to request removal, despite knowing it may be ignored, becomes an act of self-definition, reclaiming agency even when outcomes are uncertain, and these personal struggles echo the producer's larger dilemma as he debates whether to intervene more forcefully in public discourse, risking accusations of gatekeeping, or to maintain restraint and trust that the norms established will prevail, and this debate unfolds internally and among advisors, revealing fractures within the investigative community itself, some arguing that neutrality has been mistaken for weakness, others insisting that overcorrection would betray foundational principles, and the narrative captures these debates with precision, allowing disagreement without resolution, because unresolved tension is itself part of the story's honesty, and midway through Part 8 a consequential moment arrives when a respected scientific body releases a cautious review referencing several cases, including those analogous to Andes and Ohio, concluding not with extraordinary claims but with a call for improved data infrastructure, a sober document that should recalibrate discourse yet is instantly reframed by competing narratives, and the story tracks this reframing across media ecosystems, illustrating how the same text can be read as disclosure, dismissal, or distraction depending on prior belief, and this multiplicity of interpretation reinforces a central insight, that evidence does not speak in a vacuum, it is always heard through expectation. And this realization weighs heavily on the producer, who recognizes that the project's greatest challenge is no longer investigation but education, not teaching what to think but how to read, and this pedagogical turn informs a new segment focused explicitly on interpretive skills, a riskier proposition than spectacle, and the narrative dwells on the anxiety surrounding this choice, the fear that audiences will disengage, that complexity will repel, yet also the conviction that this risk is necessary. And Mateo supports this direction publicly, lending his credibility not to conclusions but to process, a move that surprises critics and allies alike, and in doing so he completes a transformation from witness to advocate for epistemic humility, and the Ohio farmer participates quietly, offering his story as an example of how misinterpretation can wound, his testimony stripped of drama yet heavy with lived consequence, and the cumulative effect of these choices is not immediate clarity but a subtle recalibration among attentive viewers, a slowing down, a shift in tone, small but perceptible. And the narrative emphasizes these marginal gains, resisting the temptation to overstate impact, and as part 8 progresses, it introduces moments of fatigue, characters questioning whether the effort is worth the cost, whether the unknown justifies the strain placed on relationships, careers, and mental health, and these doubts are treated with seriousness, acknowledging that ethical inquiry demands sustainability, not martyrdom, and the story allows characters to step back temporarily without framing it as abandonment, reinforcing that engagement with mystery need not be constant to be sincere, and as the paragraph presses toward its close, it returns once more to the Andes and Ohio not as active sites but as reference memories, reminders of origin, grounding the present struggle in the initial spark of curiosity that began it all, and the sky appears again, unchanged, indifferent to human debate, and this indifference is not portrayed as dismissal but as invitation, urgent proportion, reminding that the universe does not require our certainty, only our attention, and Part 8 ends on this tempered note, a recognition that the greatest threat to inquiry is not the absence of answers but the misuse of partial ones, and that the work ahead will demand even greater discipline, resilience, and care, setting the stage for the next movement where the question will no longer be how to investigate the unknown, but how to protect the integrity of that investigation in a world increasingly impatient with ambiguity. Part 9 carries the weight of everything accumulated before it, moving into a stage where protection rather than discovery becomes the central concern, because once a culture of inquiry exists it must be defended, and the narrative resonates at a moment of quiet recalibration, when the initial surge of misuse and distortion has subsided into a low, persistent background noise. And it is within this quieter threat that the real test emerges, subtle erosion rather than overt attack, and I follow the producer as he realizes that safeguarding integrity is not achieved through single decisions but through sustained vigilance, routine choices made without applause, and this realization reshapes his daily work, transforming editorial meetings into ethical checkpoints where framing is debated as rigorously as content, and the story lingers on these unglamorous processes, emphasizing that discipline is built through repetition, not inspiration, and Mateo, now less visible publicly, embodies this shift as well, declining most invitations, choosing instead to participate selectively where dialogue is possible, and his restraint is misinterpreted by some as retreat, yet internally he experiences it as alignment, having learned that presence without purpose dilutes meaning, and through him the narrative explores the maturation of witness identity, how stepping back can be as principled as stepping forward. And in Ohio the farmer encounters a different challenge when a new local sighting sparks excitement in his community, and neighbors turn to him for interpretation, projecting authority he never claimed, and his response is careful, redirecting attention to methods rather than meanings, encouraging documentation without speculation, and this moment illustrates the transfer of norms from media to everyday life, a subtle but significant cultural diffusion. And the story treats this as a quiet success, even though it lacks drama, and as Part 9 unfolds, institutional dynamics intensify when funding opportunities arise tied to the investigation of unidentified phenomena, introducing incentives that complicate motives, and the producer observes how language shifts in proposals, how curiosity risks being reshaped by expectations of outcome, and this tension becomes a focal point of reflection, because resources enable rigor but also introduce pressure. And the narrative does not resolve this tension neatly, instead presenting it as an ongoing negotiation. inherent to serious inquiry, and Mateo's aviation background provides a metaphor here, risk management rather than risk elimination, acknowledging that exposure is inevitable but can be mitigated through culture and training, and this metaphor resonates across the story, informing how characters approach uncertainty itself. And midway through Part 9, a revealing episode occurs when a highly anticipated public briefing delivers far less than rumored, a gap between expectation and reality that initially fuels disappointment but ultimately reinforces the narrative's core lesson, that anticipation is often self-generated, and the producer's coverage of this briefing becomes a test case, choosing to contextualize rather than amplify, to explain why the absence of revelation is not failure, and this choice provokes backlash from those invested in escalation, yet earns quiet respect from educators and practitioners who recognize the value of normalization, and the narrative tracks these divergent reactions with precision, illustrating that success metrics vary by value system, and emotionally this period is taxing, with characters experiencing doubt not about the unknown but about their capacity to sustain engagement without becoming cynical or rigid, and the story addresses this through moments of vulnerability, conversations where exhaustion is admitted without shame, reinforcing that ethical inquiry must account for human limits, and this acknowledgement allows characters to redistribute responsibility, leaning on community rather than individual endurance, and the network of witnesses, analysts, and communicators established earlier becomes more visible here, not as a movement but as an infrastructure of mutual support, exchanging feedback, flagging distortions, sharing best practices, and this decentralized resilience contrasts with earlier reliance on singular authorities, suggesting a more robust model for future engagement with anomaly. And the Andes and Ohio reappear once more as symbolic anchors when comparative analysis reveals that similar patterns of misinterpretation and overreach occurred in both cases despite cultural differences, reinforcing that the challenge is less about location or phenomenon than about human cognition under uncertainty, and this insight reframes the entire arc, positioning the story not as a chronicle of sightings but as a study of response, and as Part 9 advances it adopts a more reflective cadence, allowing space for synthesis without summary, weaving together themes of humility, patience, stewardship, and restraint, and the paragraph presses forward with deliberate calm, resisting crescendo, because maturity rarely announces itself loudly, and as it nears its end, the narrative settles on an image of continuity, the producer mentoring a younger colleague in ethical framing, Mateo logging routine flight data for a training exercise, the farmer cataloging night sky observations with students, all engaged in practices that outlast any single mystery, and this continuity suggests that the most durable outcome of the investigation is not knowledge gained but habits formed, ways of thinking embedded, and Part 9 closes on this understated but powerful note, implying that whatever the unknown ultimately reveals, the capacity to meet it responsibly is already being cultivated, inviting the reader forward into the next movement where the long-term consequences of these cultivated habits will finally be tested against events that resist preparation and challenge even the most disciplined inquiry. Part 10 arrives not with spectacle but with disruption, the kind that bypasses preparation and exposes the true strength of habits built slowly over time, and the narrative resumes at a moment when an unexpected incident forces every principle tested so far into immediate application, because a new cluster of reports emerges almost simultaneously across multiple regions, fragmented, inconsistent, and emotionally charged, spreading faster than any prior case due to timing and algorithmic amplification, and the producer recognizes instantly that this is not simply another anomaly but a stress event for the entire ecosystem of inquiry that has been cultivated, and the story follows his response in real time, the deliberate slowing of pace in the face of acceleration, The insistence on verification before commentary, even as pressure mounts from networks and audiences demanding instant interpretation, and this tension becomes the backbone of Part 10, contrasting velocity with deliberation, and Mateo experiences this disruption differently. Contacted again after months of relative quiet, his past sightings suddenly recontextualized by commentators eager to link events into narrative arcs, and his reaction is one of firm refusal to speculate, a refusal that feels heavier now because it comes with reputational cost, yet he holds to it, embodying the discipline forged earlier, and through him the narrative examines how integrity is most difficult when relevance returns. Unexpectedly, when silence is mistaken for evasion and caution for weakness, and in Ohio the farmer confronts disruption at the community level, neighbors alarmed by rumors, some convinced danger is imminent, others dismissing concerns outright, and his role shifts again, this time into mediator, not explaining the sky but calming the ground, reminding people of uncertainty without minimizing fear. A delicate balance rendered through dialogue and gesture rather than declaration, and the story emphasizes how inquiry has social responsibility beyond explanation, extending into emotional containment, and as Part 10 progresses the cluster of reports begins to unravel under scrutiny, revealing a convergence of mundane factors amplified by timing and perception, yet one element remains stubbornly unresolved, a single data point that resists easy classification. And the narrative treats this not as revelation but as remainder, something left after explanation, and the producer faces a critical choice in how to present this remainder, whether to foreground it as mystery or contextualize it as statistical outlier, and his decision to do the latter becomes emblematic of the project's evolution, prioritizing proportionality over intrigue, and this choice divides audiences sharply, testing loyalty and trust built over many months, and the story captures this division without judgment, acknowledging that different expectations coexist legitimately, and emotionally this period is draining, with characters confronting the possibility that doing the right thing may permanently alienate those who once felt seen, and this cost is not minimized, but the narrative suggests that ethical consistency cannot be contingent on approval, and as the incident fades from public attention, leaving behind a residue of argument rather than answers, the characters regroup, reflecting on what was learned not about the sky but about themselves, recognizing that preparedness is less about anticipating events than about having principles ready when events arrive, and this realization consolidates the long arc of the story, affirming that the investigation has matured from reactive curiosity into practiced stewardship, and the Andes and Ohio are invoked once more not as mysteries but as training grounds, places where discipline was forged, and Part 10 closes with a sense of earned resilience, not triumph, as the characters continue their work with quieter confidence, aware that future disruptions are inevitable but no longer defining, and the paragraph ends with a steady gaze forward rather than upward, signaling that what remains is not the chase for proof but the commitment to meet whatever comes next with clarity, restraint, and care. Part 11 turns reflective without becoming retrospective, because reflection here is not about closing a book but about understanding the shape the book has taken while still being written, and the narrative resumes in the quieter aftermath of the disruption, when the public's attention has moved on yet the internal consequences remain active, subtle, and unresolved, and this is where the deepest reckoning occurs. Not under pressure but in its absence, when motivation can no longer rely on urgency alone, and I follow the producer as he confronts a question that had been deferred repeatedly, whether the project, having matured into a discipline-focused endeavor, can survive in an environment that consistently rewards spectacle, and this question is not framed as despair but as strategic realism, prompting difficult conversations about sustainability, audience trust, and the responsibility to know when continuation serves purpose and when it risks dilution, and these conversations unfolds slowly, carefully, with no dramatic confrontation, emphasizing that meaningful decisions are often anticlimactic, and this tone permeates part 11, mirroring the emotional register of a phase where growth is measured internally rather than externally, and Mateo's arc deepens in parallel as he revisits his original logs and notes for the first time in months. Not searching for overlooked clues but examining how his language has changed over time, noticing how certainty has softened into precision, how emotional immediacy has given way to analytical clarity, and this linguistic evolution becomes a mirror of personal change, prompting him to acknowledge that the most significant outcome of his experience was not what he saw but how it altered his relationship with doubt, and this realization is shared quietly with his family, who respond not with awe but with relief. Because for them the investigation's value has always been measured in his well-being rather than its conclusions, and this grounding humanizes the abstract themes, reminding the reader that inquiry unfolds within lives, not apart from them. And in Ohio the farmer reaches a similar inflection point when a student he has been mentoring presents an independent analysis of night sky data, cautious, methodical, and unremarkable in its conclusions. And the farmer feels an unexpected sense of pride not because the work reveals anything extraordinary but because it exemplifies restraint, demonstrating that the norms he struggled to learn have been successfully transmitted, and this transmission becomes a quiet marker of legacy, suggesting that influence need not be visible to be real, and as these personal moments accumulate, the narrative broadens to consider the cultural footprint of the investigation, observing how language around unidentified phenomena has subtly shifted in public discourse, with fewer absolutist claims and more conditional phrasing appearing in serious outlets, and while this shift is uneven and fragile, it is treated as meaningful progress, the result of sustained modeling rather than persuasion, and the producer recognizes this as validation of a long-held belief, that demonstrating how to think is more durable than telling people what to think, and this belief crystallizes into a guiding principle that informs future decisions, including the controversial choice to reduce output frequency in favor of depth, a decision framed not as retreat but as alignment with values, and this choice provokes predictable backlash, yet the narrative frames backlash as a signal rather than a verdict, something to be interpreted rather than obeyed, and the emotional toll of this stance is acknowledged openly. Moments of self-doubt, questions about relevance, fears of obsolescence, all rendered without melodrama, because maturity includes vulnerability without collapse. And midway through part 11 the story returns briefly to the sky through a scene of collective observation, an organized but low-key event where participants gather not to witness a phenomenon but to practice documentation, calibration, and shared silence, and this scene is described with care, emphasizing absence over presence, reinforcing the idea that looking does not require finding, and this ritualized observation serves as a symbolic culmination of the investigative culture, a community engaging with the unknown without demanding performance, and Mateo and the Ohio farmer participate remotely, connected by intention rather than location, illustrating the distributed nature of the network that has formed, and this moment crystallizes the story's central transformation, from a pursuit driven by anomaly to one sustained by practice, and as part 11 advances toward its close, attention turns to the future not as prediction but as preparation, characters discussing how their frameworks might adapt to new technologies, new data sources, new forms of distortion. And these discussions are grounded in humility, acknowledging that no system is immune to misuse, but that adaptability is itself a form of integrity, and the paragraph weaves these threads together into a cohesive emotional texture, calm but alert, resolved but open, and as it nears its end, the narrative articulates a subtle shift in question, from what is out there, to what kind of investigators are we becoming, a question that cannot be answered definitively but can be lived into, And part 11 closes on this lived question, a sense of poised continuation, not demanding a finale but inviting one, suggesting that what remains is not another mystery to chase but a final reckoning with meaning, legacy, and the limits of proof itself, preparing the ground for the concluding movement where the long arc of inquiry will not resolve the unknown but will finally clarify what has been learned about the human need to engage with it. Part 12 unfolds as a quiet culmination rather than a conclusion, because the story it carries was never moving toward an answer but toward a posture, and so the final movement does not resolve the unknown but settles into clarity about what has been shaped along the way, and the narrative resumes in a space of deliberate stillness, after decisions have been made, outputs reduced, expectations recalibrated. And what remains is the long view, the sense that something durable has taken form beneath the surface of events, and I follow the producer as he walks through an archive of the project's work, not the sensational clips but the marginal notes, the methodological revisions, the internal memos arguing for restraint, and this archival encounter becomes reflective without nostalgia, revealing a trajectory from urgency to stewardship. And he recognizes that the most meaningful legacy of the investigation is not a body of evidence but a set of habits now embedded in practice. Habits that will persist even if the project itself eventually ends, and this recognition brings neither triumph nor loss but a grounded acceptance, and Mateo's arc reaches its own quiet resolution as he returns once more to the mountains, not as a witness seeking confirmation but as a man revisiting a place that altered him, and his experience there is intentionally uneventful, the sky ordinary, the terrain familiar, and yet the absence of anomaly does not feel empty, because he understands now that meaning does not require repetition, and this understanding allows him to release the night of his sighting from the burden of explanation, integrating it fully into memory without demand, and this integration is portrayed through simple action, a long walk, a steady breath, a final glance upward that carries curiosity without urgency, and in Ohio the farmer completes a parallel journey. Not through travel but through continuity, watching another season change, teaching another group of students how to document the sky responsibly, and when asked directly what he thinks he saw years ago, he answers honestly that he does not know, and that he is comfortable with that not knowing, and this comfort is not resignation but confidence, confidence in process, confidence in restraint, confidence that uncertainty does not diminish truth but contextualizes it. And the narrative treats this moment as emblematic, not because it offers closure but because it demonstrates maturity, and as these personal arcs settle, the story widens one final time to consider the broader cultural landscape, observing that discourse around unidentified phenomena remains contested, uneven, and volatile, yet within that volatility there now exist pockets of discipline, communities that value proportion over proclamation, and the narrative does not overstate their influence, acknowledging that sensationalism remains dominant, but it asserts quietly that alternatives now exist, and that existence matters, and the producer reflects on this as he prepares a final segment not framed as a finale but as a pause, an articulation of principles rather than findings, emphasizing that inquiry is ongoing but that pauses are necessary for recalibration, and this segment is received with predictable ambivalence, some expressing gratitude, others frustration. And the story accepts both as valid responses to a culture accustomed to answers rather than practices, and the emotional tone of Part 12 remains steady, neither melancholic nor celebratory, grounded in the recognition that meaningful work often concludes not with resolution but with readiness, and this readiness is explored through a final collective moment, a dispersed yet synchronized act of observation, people across different places looking at the same sky at the same time, not expecting anything, simply attending, recording conditions, sharing silence. And this act is framed not as ritual but as discipline made visible, a living embodiment of what the investigation has become, and the Andes and Ohio exist within this moment not as mysteries but as coordinates in a shared map of curiosity, reminders of where the journey began without dictating where it must end, and the paragraph presses forward gently, weaving together past and present without summarizing, allowing resonance rather than recap, and as it approaches its final cadence, the narrative articulates its most distilled insight, that proof, in the deepest sense, is not a thing discovered but a relationship maintained, a relationship with evidence, with doubt, with one another, and that maintaining this relationship requires humility, patience, and courage, virtues less dramatic than revelation but far more sustaining, and the story ends not by looking upward for answers but by looking outward at people engaged in thoughtful practice, suggesting that whatever exists beyond our understanding will remain there whether we chase it or not, but how we choose to engage with the unknown defines us. And in that definition lies the true outcome of the long inquiry. Not certainty, not disclosure, but a quieter, harder-won clarity about the kind of attention we bring to a universe that does not explain itself, and the paragraph closes on that clarity, open rather than sealed, complete not because every question has been answered but because the question of how to live with unanswered questions has been met with intention, integrity, and care.